the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. This morning, David and Crystal Downing, who happens to be me, are joined by our producer, Aaron Hill, and someone who has been holding the Wade Center together for about 45 years. But why we invited her to join us is she helped edit what I consider one of the most delightful books that I have read since I have been co-director at the Wade Center. Her name is Marjorie Mead, and she's agreed to come and sit in our cold basement to talk to us about letters to children. So Marge, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a delight to be here.
And this book we're discussing was published in 1985 by Macmillan, and it was put together by Marjorie Mead and the director of the Wade at the time, who was named Lyle Dorset. And the first thing I want to hear from you, Marge, is what ignited this project? How did you come up with the idea to put together all of C.S. Lewis's letters to children?
Lyle had first connected to the Wade Center when he was researching his biography of Joy Davidman. And as part of that, we invited Doug Gresham, who at that point had done nothing really publicly related
Explain to our listeners who Doug is.
Douglas Gresham is C.S. Lewis's stepson, the younger of two boys.
Explain to us who C.S. Lewis is.
And the concept of a stepson.
I was told that I had permission to be childish in this episode. Because of
That won't be hard for you.
Podcast for children.
And so Doug came to the Wade Center before Lyle. Lyle was still writing the book, writing his biography of Joy. And so Doug was interviewed over 2 days. Lyle and I got to know him very well. And I also got to know Lyle better as a result. And so a year later, Lyle he'd been interviewed and invited to come and be the second director after Dr. Kilby retired. Dr. Kilby was the founder of the Wade Center. So Lyle was his background is history. He's a historian and he's a wonderful researcher. And so he immediately decided one of his main goals was to begin an oral history project at the Wade Center. And so he came in 1983, and in 1984, the summer of, he went over with his wife Mary, and they recorded a lot of interviews. And one of those interviews was with a woman named Mary Nayland, who was a former student of Lewis's. And Mary had some lovely letters from Lewis. He was very kind to her as she went through various struggles in her life. And she also had, there were also letters to her daughter, Sarah, who was Lewis's godchild.
I have a theory that Mary Nayland is the model for Jane Studdick in That Hideous Strength. I published that in 7, the online version.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and you can just go to the Wade website and find David's article on Mary Nayland and Jane Studdick.
Yes. Yes.
It has a really cool title. Is Mary Jane?
Oh, yes.
And so when he came back with the letters and we were reading them, and they're wonderful letters, and we just sort of looked at each other, and I don't even, it just sort of, we both said, these need to be published. And then as we started talking, we started thinking, well, what if we did a book of letters to children?
Oh.
And we were in close touch with Doug, and he became aware of it. He was very supportive and excited about it. You notice he did did a foreword to the book,
Yes.
and so it was it was a wonderful, easy project.
Yeah. What struck me, and because of this podcast, it was the first time I have ever read this book. And as I was reading it, since David is a internationally known Lewis scholar.
Let the record show that she's pointing to David Downing.
That here in Letters to Children, David was gleaning a lot of details that he put in his scholarly books. I mean, the riches of just even letters to little children. And what strikes me is how Lewis is very aware of audience. So he'll be writing
Yeah.
letters like this, his godchild, Sarah. In the early letters, he sounds like he's talking to a little girl, but in later letters, he's advising her how to improve her poetry and talking about rhyme and meter. I mean, it's so indicative of Lewis's awareness of the needs of other people. I mean, it just impresses me all the more about Lewis. And David, how did you discover all these riches that you put into your own books in Letters to Children?
Well, a lot of the letters are about Narnia. He got a lot of thousands of letters, apparently. People would ask things like, whatever happened to those picnickers who got turned to stone by the White Witch? And Lewis had to write back and say, well, the same time that all the other animals were turned back into living form, that also the picnickers. And so he was very aware, a lot of it had to do with Narnia, and he did not patronize children or give them oversimplified answers.
Right.
When I was doing the Narnia research, I discovered how many insights he shared with children about the composition of Narnia or the meaning of certain characters. And also I discovered very charmingly, and they have some reproductions in this book, that he would add little pictures.
Yeah.
He draws a picture of a cat from the back, and he says, I can't do faces, so I just draw cats from the back. It was just such a cute thing and he would include little poems about animals and things that children would enjoy. I think he had such a vivid memory of his own childhood, which you can see in the Narnia Chronicles. And he remembered being patronized as a child. And so when he became an adult, he didn't want to treat children that way.
Yeah, in fact, in one of the letters, he actually says to a child that when I was 50, part of me was still 12, and when I was 12, part of me was already 50. So that is why he could, as David says, write so well to children. Now, Marge, tell me, how did you choose which letters to include in this volume?
Well, we basically included all the children's letters that we were aware of at that time.
Oh, okay.
And so some letters have come to light in the subsequent years that I would have loved to have put in here, but we didn't have.
Right.
They weren't out in the public. So.
Right. In fact, David mentioned the letter you just saw being offered.
It was a
at Sotheby's.
one-page handwritten letter to a child, and it was $46,000.
Wow.
And so
Yeah.
part of the reason for this podcast is everybody check your pockets. It was an interesting letter because it said that you notice that Peter and Susan don't come back after the second adventure. As you get older, you tend to lose interest. There's a lot of controversy about, why didn't Susan make it to the new Narnia? And he must be sexist because she likes lipstick. But in this letter, he says Peter and Susan are not coming back. As you get older, the world of wonder and imagination can fade from your consciousness.
Yeah.
Well, and this just emphasizes the importance of the Wade Center, where we have numerous letters of C.S. Lewis by C.S. Lewis, including letters to children, that if you make an appointment, you can come look at those letters for free. Yeah. Marge, as you and Lyle were putting this together, how did you divide up the responsibilities? Like, did one of you write because there is an intro, but there's also an overview of C.S. Lewis's life. How did you do that?
I reread it for this, and I know one of us wrote one of them, and the other wrote the other, and then we handed them to each other.
Oh, right.
And then we added our parts and whatever, and it was a totally. We worked really well together, and I don't remember
process, right?
any discussion or issues, but I can look at both of them and see, I wrote that, but I don't remember which one I wrote first. I think I wrote the biography first, and I think he wrote the general intro first, but that's just honestly.
Right.
That sounds like a project for researchers in 100 years.
Yes.
They could develop a documentary hypothesis.
Exactly.
Right.
Amazing woman at the Wade.
Keyword and
Marjorie.
writing analysis, and they can go through and identify the Marge elements and the Lyle elements.
Marge always talks about Yahweh. That's the giveaway.
I can tell you one thing I did all by myself that Lyle approved, but did you notice that little note to children?
Which?
Oh, yeah, in the front. Yeah.
In the front. Uh-huh.
Oh,
Sure.
yes.
And here, let me see if I can pull it up real fast. It's something that just as we were working on this and just based on my interaction with visitors and so on, I just had this idea that it might be a helpful thing. And I had written, "We hope that you enjoy these letters. They were written to children just like you who read and loved the Chronicles of Narnia." C.S. Lewis said that he wrote these tales because they were the sort of books he would have liked to have read when he was a child. And though the letters in this book do not have your name on them, consider that they are yours. For surely if he could have, C.S. Lewis would have written them to you.
Yeah.
Now,
That's lovely.
here's a story connected to that. A few years after this book was published, a woman came by to visit the Wade Center, and this was before we were in the new building, so probably was in the late 1980s. She was interested in seeing things related to Lewis, so I was showing her around. I hadn't introduced myself as such. We don't always when we're just showing people. And she was talking about being at a conference, and at that conference, she said she'd gone, she was very sad that, she had never had the chance to meet C.S. Lewis or write to him. So she ended up, she told me she had gone to the book table at the conference and she had seen a copy and she said, "That's the book I saw." And she pulled Letters to Children off the shelf. And she said, "Let me show you something." And she turned to that note and she said, "Look at that." She said, I went up to my room and I read that note and I just cried and I felt better.
Oh, wow.
Sweet.
I never told her I'd written it or anything. I just let it be what it was. But, I don't know if anybody else in the world ever cared about that note, but it was a way that God worked in that woman's heart to give her a sense of connection to these letters. And I agree with what you were saying, Crystal. These are wonderful letters, but all of Lewis's letters, they are just, people don't, they love his writings, but not as many people as I wish have had the opportunity or taken the opportunity to even read the published ones.
Right.
And they're wonderful.
Yeah. And even the biographical intro that you and Lyle worked on together, I think is one of the most enjoyable intros I've read about Lewis, because you just, first of all, you focus a lot on his childhood and delightful little incidents that I hadn't heard of before. Like anytime he saw, when he was a real little boy, he'd be 2 and see men in trousers, he just thought it was his father.
Yeah.
And I loved that incident because when I was about 5 years old, I went to pick up my little brother from Sunday school after church, and all the adults are standing in front of the church. And my brother, Garth, ran up to the first pair of man's legs he saw because he's only 2 and he couldn't see up high. And so men's legs and trousers were the sign of daddy.
Yeah.
And he just put his arms around the legs, and of
And
course,
we never saw that little boy again.
no. And I was so embarrassed as a 5-year-old, and I was pulling Garth's arms from those legs, and then he'd run to another set of pants. So that connected to me, and I'm sure a lot of people, as they read these letters, go, "Oh, yes, that's the way I thought. That was the questions I had about Narnia." And that's what makes this book so delightful.
Yeah. Yeah, he does. I was going to say that you mentioned his speaking to the audience and the empathy. He doesn't patronize them, but he does talk to them in a way that's age appropriate. But in a way that is, he's sort of the best version of their age. He's not talking down to them, but he feels like he's talking to them eye to eye.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it says a lot about him and his character, the way he was able to communicate with children and empathize with them.
I just had a book come out a couple months ago called C.S. Lewis on Writing and Writers. And
Which, let me insert, is now a New York Times bestseller.
Ooh.
Go on.
Mainly because they like my 3-page intro, not Lewis's letters.
That's it.
right.
Yeah.
It's just excerpts from Lewis's books and letters.
Yeah,
But a
it's
number
great.
of the excerpts come from letters to children.
Yes.
They would send him a piece of writing, and he would critique it very candidly, tactfully. But he wouldn't just say, "Oh, this is great. You're doing great." He would actually say, "Well, you describe your wonderful night very well, but you didn't really capture the wonder. Don't use an adjective like awesome or wonderful. try to evoke that feeling in the reader. And he says, too often writers use an adjective which says to the reader, could you do my work for me? And that's a very great insight about writing that many adult writers need to hear.
Yeah,
but he's
show, don't
telling it
tell.
to a little child.
Yeah, right.
Well, Marge, are there examples of letters from the book that are just your favorite that you want to share? I know, obviously, we can't go through everything that's in the book, but there's some really neat letters in there.
There are a number, and that obviously depends on, what I was thinking. The letters on writing, I've often pointed adult writers to them as well. I really love the letter he wrote to his goddaughter, Sarah, on her confirmation. I think what he says about taking your first communion or any communion, it's the idea that, whether the emotion is there, that does not, it's a gift. It's not unimportant or meaningless, but it does not validate the meaning of what you're doing. The meaning is there regardless of what you feel. And that's something Lewis wrote on, and Dorothy Sayers as well. And
Yay! I knew Marge would get her
I'd
in.
help you out.
Yeah.
But so I wish more youth pastors or parents or people knew this wonderful letter in terms of confirmation, because I think it's a great thing to tell at any age, because adults struggle with that too.
Yeah.
I love a letter in here very much that's not written to a child. It's written to Lawrence's mother.
Oh, right.
And I used to use that a lot when I was teaching on Narnia.
Ugh.
And, it's just a powerful letter, and I'm going to let you come and read it for yourself and pick, you can pick up the book from your local library or wherever, come read it at the Wade Center. But it is a little boy who was struggling because he felt he loved Aslan more than Jesus. And you can see how kindly and wonderfully and genuinely Lewis was distraught that he might have worried this little boy. There's also a letter towards the end of the book, just shortly before Lewis died. He wrote to a young girl named Ruth, and he said, if you continue to love Jesus, nothing very much can go wrong with you.
Oh, right.
And, those are just, and it's what you were saying, Lewis, that's what I was struck by, I think, years ago, and I continue to be struck by, is Lewis really, he talked about being shy around children, and I'm sure he was, but to some degree, he was not as open even with people who weren't his close friends.
Yeah.
His letters show a side of him that he would not have shown to them in public.
Yeah.
He was more comfortable giving them, whether it was literary or spiritual counsel or whatever. But in these letters, he just meets these children on common ground. He writes more about nature in these letters because it's something he knew he noticed as a child.
Yeah.
And he writes, it's just, they are lovely, lovely letters.
You mentioned Lawrence. The letters are by first name. Lawrence Krieg, I think, was the name of it. And we were doing a program at the Wade Center, and we had a book giveaway. And if you were like the fifth person to send in an email, you would get. And one of the people said, "Oh, my father is the Lawrence who was in Letters to Children."
Oh.
Yeah,
Wow.
He grew up to become a Christian, raised his children as Christians, and now his children are, I'd say his grandchildren are enjoying the Narnia Chronicles.
That's so crazy.
Another one we followed, the Kathy in Letters to Children, is now Kathy Keller.
Right.
And we interviewed her for a podcast.
Right. Married to Tim Keller, who's written quite a bit about Lewis's influence on him.
Right. But what she liked was she sent him a writing sample, and he wrote back and said, we writers, we have to be careful about this and that. And she loved the idea that C.S. Lewis was including her, we writers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
She said it was like there's a lion in Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe where Aslan says, well, we lions will do this and the rest of you do that.
Yeah.
And one of the lions says, did you hear that? He said, we lions.
Yeah.
And she felt the same way about saying we writers.
Yeah.
So she was completely charmed by the letters she got from him as a
Well,
child.
that's what you get, is a sense of Lewis's humility in these letters. Not only will he do something like that, but then he'll describe himself taking a bath and that he looks like a hippopotamus with his nostrils above the water. And he talks about a time when he had chicken pox and his beard grew out and it was red and yellow. And, you just, it creates this wonderful picture in his mind. And so he's creating verbal pictures even in his letters.
Yeah. I was going to tell you another child in here. Many of your listeners may not know the name Aiden Mackey, but he is just a longtime friend of the Wade Centers and a Chesterton scholar. And his daughter, Patricia, her letters are in here.
Oh, I had made that connection.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. We intentionally didn't use last names. So sometimes he would even write like Dear Kilmer, and we'd change it to Dear Hugh,
Oh, okay.
And it was, just a number of reasons.
Yeah.
You're talking about this woman who regretted she hadn't written to Lewis. I was a child when some of these letters were written, when the Narnia Chronicles came out. And my mother didn't have me reading the Narnia Chronicles. Later when I was in college, I said, why didn't you have me read the Narnia Chronicles? It's such a wonderful introduction to Christian faith. And my mom said, well, Lewis drank and smoked, and he was an Anglican, so I just wasn't sure if he was a good role model for children. So I was reading Pete and Penny Play and Pray. And I never wrote the author of that book.
Right.
Every time I encounter somebody that has a kid or a teenager that's struggling with their faith, the first thing I recommend that they do is read the Chronicles of Narnia.
I think that's a good suggestion.
That is
That's
a great suggestion.
Yeah.
Yes. And again, the value of the Wade, especially now that the number of young people are leaving the church in the millions every year.
Yeah.
But they're still interested in Tolkien. They're still interested in Lewis. And to be able to draw them to Christ through the imagination, which is exactly what happened to C.S. Lewis. He read George MacDonald, one of our authors, and said his imagination was baptized.
Yeah.
And I think even these letters, this book, Letters to Children, would be something that parents could give to adult children struggling with their faith, but who liked the Narnia Chronicles when they were little, because it doesn't use highfalutin theological language, but he's talking about the truth.
Yeah, you could take some of the concepts in this and the truths that and how he communicates them and apply them, I would say, to, almost all spiritual or, real life situations. I mean, a couple that you mentioned, Marge, about, if you love Jesus, nothing much can go wrong with you. There's just all these really kernels and nuggets that he gives to these children in a way they can understand it, but they apply to more situations than just Aslan,
Yeah, absolutely.
I had a student about 20 years ago. I taught a course called fantasy literature. And of course, I snuck in Tolkien and Lewis, a little bit of MacDonald. It wasn't Christian fantasy. This was at a non-Christian college. And the student just wrote me this week and said, I got married. Now I've got kids of my own. I'm getting ready to read them Narnia. And now I'm really curious. Is there somewhere I can find out more about the background of Narnia? And I go, how about my book on Narnia? But it was interesting. When he took the class, it was all rather hypothetical. I think he was a Christian young man, but he wasn't particularly engaged.
Yeah.
But now that has his children coming up and wants to read them Narnia, he has this renewed curiosity about the composition process and the hidden meanings.
Right.
But I like how the title of the book and the way that it's framed with everything doesn't make it like, well, this is just a Q&A with Lewis about Chronicles of Narnia or something like that.
Right.
Because it really is
letters
to children from C.S. Lewis that can speak to you, even if you haven't read, the Chronicles of Narnia. The advice he gives is relevant regardless of what situation you're coming from.
And that's what we really were trying to do to make this book just make it something that children can pick up and read.
Yeah.
Yes.
But to your point, several of you made, I heard recently from someone I had known when they were a graduate student at Wheaton and had gone through some difficult things. And when I knew this student, I had mentioned at one point, and I won't give any more details in this, that, had they ever read the Chronicles of Narnia, and they hadn't. And this person had started reading them, and they were a big help. At the Wade Center, the Tolkien Society has occasionally done some, plays based on books. And on the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the first time that was done, and it's just a very low-key, no-ticket
the students write the script themselves. Yeah.
Right. But a friend of mine had come and had her young granddaughter there. And when they were leaving, after, because it's The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, and she's walking out and she goes, "Grandma, that's an Easter story."
Oh,
So a 4-year-old got it.
Right.
Wow. Oh, that is so good.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, he really challenged some of these young people intellectually in the letters. One of them wrote, The Voice of the Dawn Treader, he says, "Well, I'm also in your world by a different name." And the little girl named Hyla wrote and said, "Well, what's Aslan's name in our world?" And rather than just blurting it out, he says, "Who else came about Christmas time?
Yeah.
Who else died?" And he gives a bunch of clues, but he wants her to work out the parallels without getting into allegory.
Yeah.
In general, he put so much thought into his letters. A lot of us, you get an email and you kind of go, "Thanks, I enjoyed this, have a good," but even to children, he put so much thought into how he was going to reply to their
Which is
questions.
fascinating because oftentimes he'll be like, I've just got too many letters to respond to. And I'm sure he had a ton of letters, but you also have to think part of the reason why he felt so burdened by, even if he had 50 letters to respond to, is because he wanted to give each of them a sincere and thoughtful response. You know what I mean? And he couldn't just send away some template response or whatever.
Right.
Because that was just, was the exact opposite. He wanted to help all of these people.
You all say in your intro that he considered it his God-given duty.
Yes.
He really
to
did.
help cultivate people's souls, even through correspondence.
Yeah. Very Christ-like, because he put the needs of others above his own needs.
Yes.
And there were days that he'd spend 5 hours writing letters, and it was not a fun task at all. Even though the letters themselves are fun, he sacrificed time that he could have used, for doing something that he would rather have done.
And the hard part about that is, at least back then, he would write these letters, and then Lawrence grows up and he's a Christian. He raises his children to be Christians and his grandchildren and stuff. And so there is this long-lasting, even eternal impact. But he's not seeing that immediately. So you're just pouring out on a daily basis, and you don't know how they're responding, or he's not there to watch them read the letter. And so it really is draining in a way, just giving of himself.
Right.
But the wonderful part, think about letters, how often people get a letter and they throw it out.
Yes.
These letters, Lewis didn't keep the letters from his correspondence, with rare exceptions like Dorothy Sayers.
Yes.
But I'm helping. But these letters were kept by their recipients because they meant so much.
Yeah.
And they have been so generous in sharing them with other people.
Yes.
And I will say this, the Wade Center, most of the letters we have were gifts to us. And, if any listeners to this podcast know somebody who has a letter, and even if it's too precious for them to let go of, if they're willing to make a digital copy and give it to the Wade Center, it can be used in the lives of other people.
Right.
And it will help people. And that's God's providence.
Yeah.
Well, because as Crystal mentioned earlier, people can come to the Wade Center and get access to all of this stuff in one place, as opposed to being independently wealthy, I guess, and going out and you'd have to buy all these things up. Or
a $46,000 letter.
Yeah, or we talked about one of the books that we read that was a compilation of all these essays and articles that have been published in different magazines.
Right.
There'd be no way that you could go out and get each of those to go buy an antique copy of all these magazines yourself, but you can come to the Wade and access all these resources. You can even watch that interview that Lyle did with Douglas Gresham. I remember watching the video of that. I think he has like a red turtleneck on. It looks very 1980s. It's really fun to watch, actually. It's neat. But
cute.
you can access all
It
that
was
stuff at the Wade.
1982, I can tell you exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
One of the things that struck me as I read these letters is how often Lewis was saying, "No, I'm not going to write another Narnia Chronicle." You can tell that children were pleading with him to add an 8th chronicle. And you can see why he said no, because, the last battle is about the end and going to heaven further up and farther in, or farther up, further in. And
Well, further up and further in.
okay,
Both furthers,
whatever.
Just further up and keep on going.
You can do it, buddy.
Straight on till morning.
I want to say about finishing.
Wait. Let me finish this point. So what he said multiple times to these children is, well, why don't you write your own Narnia Chronicle?
Yeah.
But I think a lot of that, he was talking about just writing for fun. He did the boxing stories with his brother for fun. He says in several points, if you really have the itch to write, it's not about publication or becoming famous or getting accolades. He says ink is a drug. You just have this habit of wanting to write. So I don't know if he was inviting them to write for publication just to enjoy their own Narnia stories.
It's the difference between, I want to create something, right? You want to make a painting or you want to make a piece of furniture or something. And it's the difference between wanting to do that and then feeling like, well, I have to be able to mass manufacture it and sell it to the public. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because you could make a piece of art or a piece of furniture or something and display it in your own home and be something that you love and you appreciate. And it doesn't necessarily have to be something that, people in Japan can purchase. You know what I mean?
Right. And he actually makes that point. I know people who they don't want to be nobodies. And so a couple of years they'll do photography and then they'll try to become a musician and then they will decide to be a novelist. And the underlying theme seems to be that they need to be.
Sorry, we're having a little trouble with our mics here.
Where's you've broken the head here.
To be fair, Crystal, only David is having trouble with his mic.
I know.
Okay, I won't touch it. I'll just leave it exactly where it is. Lewis wrote a beautiful letter, not to a child, but to his friend Arthur Greaves, after his first poem was published and received very little notice, or his first book of poems.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, there's actually something kind of cleansing about just licking your wounds and saying, no, why am I writing in the first place? Is it all about receiving recognition?
Yeah.
Or is it just the pleasure of getting one's words on the page?
Right.
So, and sometimes I think he's giving children the same kind of advice.
Yeah. Yeah. We run into that a lot where people just want to publish a book just for the sake of publishing a book. And then they'll, because Lewis Books publish so easily, they'll publish a book that says nothing that hasn't already been said numerous times before. And so it shows that they aren't really trying to help expand knowledge. They're just doing something out of self-interest, which is the exact opposite of C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
Another way that people ignore Lewis while they write about Lewis is he inherited from Owen Barfield this idea of chronological snobbery, of how people just ignore books and ideas of the past. And it's just snobbery about the past. And so these people write books about Lewis and they exercise chronological snobbery, ignoring what has been done in the past. And that's why I'm so happy to be able to celebrate this book published in 1985, because it is great. I recommend everybody, if they have an opportunity, to try to find one. You can write us at the Wade Center, and we'll have Marge autograph a copy for you. Wade@wheaton.edu.
Yeah, and it definitely it contrasts with we've talked about on the podcast before with Tolkien's view of subcreation, and then even Sayer's views on it as well. It reminds me of the book Leaf by Nigel that we've talked about on the podcast. Right. And you have to think like, well, what if the only reason he was trying to paint that tree and those leaves was because he wanted it to, be sold in an art museum or something. It totally changes the tenor of the book, as opposed to this is something that he felt he had to get out of himself because he just had to create.
Right. He does talk about Lord of the Rings in one of his letters to children. And wow, what a recommendation. And it's just so terse, so succinct, where he says the Lord of the Rings is about life because the darkness is never defeated, but the darkness is never triumphant over the light. And that's the way real life is. Mm-hmm. That just because you become a Christian, just because you follow the truth, doesn't mean life is going to be easy.
Well, are there any final insights or things from the book, Marge, that you feel like worth pointing out, or things that people might be interested in learning when they pick up a copy? Obviously, we want to give away everything, but anything else you want to highlight?
Well, I will say the reason we did this book is because we loved these letters and we wanted to share them. And
Thank
I
you.
appreciate that Crystal and David have been enjoying them. I know David's been using them for years, but they, that was, I think, what prompted that desire to write that little note to children, especially but because I'd heard kids talk about that. Oh, I wish I had. But we can't write to Lewis, but not only in this book, but in other places, we can read his wisdom and his kindness and be the recipient of it. And I just would encourage people, just go read some Lewis letters.
Yes. That's great advice.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.